Hey everyone,
I'm Tim, and I've just finished a 9-month odyssey around Latin America. Now I'm reopening my diaries, and this time I'm bringing you along with me. Week by week, country by country, all the colors, all the craziness, all the food, all the music, and all the splendor. 9 months when each morning was a new adventure. The road was my companion, and Latin America cast its spell on me. This is my Latin America Diaries. Welcome back to my Latin America Diaries. It was finally time to leave Nicaragua behind and head onwards to my next destination, El Salvador. And to do that, I had booked a tourist shuttle from the city of Leon to my next destination in El Salvador, Playa El Tunco. And this is where I received my introduction to the wonderful world of Central American tourist shuttles. Central America has plenty of buses running, however, often they don't link the main tourist towns and tourist sites that tend to be out of the way or out of major cities. In addition to that, the journeys in this part of the world often require several international border crossings. For example, in my case, traveling from Leon in Nicaragua to El Tunco in El Salvador meant passing through a narrow stretch of Honduras in between. That required exiting Nicaragua, entering Honduras, then exiting Honduras and entering El Salvador, all in the same day. While it's certainly possible to piece together local bus schedules and border crossings by yourself, it can quickly become complicated and very time-consuming. Tourist shuttle companies solve that problem by taking care of the logistics. They know the border crossing formalities, they provide all the paperwork, and they very quickly shuttle tourists to and from major destinations on the Central American Isthmus. Another thing that you discover about these shuttles is that they often leave at ridiculous hours of the morning. But there is a method to the madness here, and that is because Central American land borders often close overnight and open at 6 a.m. These shuttle bus companies pick you up very early in the morning in order to arrive at the border first thing before it opens, and that way the shuttle bus passengers will be the first people across the border in the morning. It often saves hours and hours of waiting later in the day. So it was 3:30 in the morning when my shuttle came and picked me up outside my hostel, and I climbed on board bleary-eyed, thinking that I was the only one in the bus that morning. The van was dark, and as we closed the door and then continued on our way through the streets of Leon, I wasn't sure if we were going to pick up other passengers, but it certainly felt a bit strange that I was alone in the shuttle that morning. Or at least I thought I was. As I was sitting there, out of the darkness emerged this grunt, and it turned out that there was actually someone who had passed out asleep on the seat behind me. The other passenger was this aging surfer dude who had spent the past decade living in Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, teaching surf schools along the Pacific coast of Central America. It turns out that he'd been out drinking the night before and had made it back to his accommodation just in time to pick up his luggage and then throw himself into the shuttle and then fall asleep sprawled out on the seat behind me, which was where I entered the story. On paper, it sounded like the beginning of a travel nightmare, but in reality, he actually just dozed off to sleep again, and I managed to get in a couple of hours sleep before we eventually reached the Honduran border. Because there was only the two of us on the shuttle, the process was pretty simple to get across the border. However, entering Honduras required us to give our fingerprints, and that was where I noticed that he was having a bit of trouble with his fingerprint, or giving his fingerprint to the reader at the customs post. The reason for that became obvious when I noticed that his index finger was actually shaped a little bit differently to the average Homo sapiens index finger. So I asked him if that had ever caused him trouble in his life, and he was very forthcoming with his story, and he was like, oh yes, it became like that after I had a brick fight a couple of years ago. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd never really thought about a brick fight being a thing, so I kind of looked at him and was like, a brick fight? And then he was like, yeah, like when you're walking down the street and then you get into a fight with someone and they start throwing bricks at you. So it turns out that a couple of years earlier, he had gotten into a fight with someone on a street in Central America near a construction site, and the person started throwing bricks at him. And of course, naturally, I guess, he started throwing bricks back. The etiquette of brick warfare on a shuttle bus at dawn in Honduras. Tick. Unfortunately, one of the bricks that was being thrown at him managed to land directly on the index finger of the hand that he was using to hold the next brick that he was about to lob over. It smashed it up, and he spent the next couple of weeks in a Central American hospital. So if you've ever wondered about the dangers of international travel, perhaps add brick fights to the list. The rest of the journey through Honduras was thankfully less eventful. Honduras has something of a reputation for insecurity, and at times has actually recorded some of the highest homicide rates in the world. Most travelers pass through without incident. However, for the casual traveler in this region, it remains one of the more intimidating countries to visit. This is another reason why the tourist shuttles are so popular, because they cut out the need to spend time at local bus stands or in major cities. Tourists are not normally targeted in Honduras, but there's always the possibility of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I would actually visit Honduras later on this journey, and believe me, it was absolutely worth it. Stay tuned for that. One interesting complication, however, involves British travelers. Due to a long-running visa and diplomatic row between the United Kingdom and Honduras, the process to be given a visa for Honduras can often be very lengthy, almost impossible for British travelers. As a result, the tourist shuttle companies have come up with a workaround. Instead of crossing Honduras by road, British travelers are often transported to the port of Potosi on Nicaragua's Pacific coast, where they board a boat to La Union in El Salvador, bypassing Honduran territory altogether. It's a rather creative solution to a bureaucratic problem. Fortunately, traveling on an Australian passport, I didn't need to worry about any of that. A couple of hours later, we crossed our second international border for the day, and then suddenly we were in El Salvador. At the border post, I picked up a SIM card, and then we continued west across this pocket-sized country towards the Pacific coast and the famous surf town of El Tunco. I wasn't actually staying in Playa El Tunco itself. Instead, I had booked accommodation in nearby Playa El Palmacito, a quieter beach community just down the road. There, I checked into the lovely hammock plantation hostel, tucked away amongst lush tropical gardens at the end of a palm tree-lined country lane leading towards the ocean. With its swimming pool, relaxed atmosphere, and welcoming family hosts, it felt like exactly the right place to unwind after a day that had begun at 3:30 in the morning and involved 3 countries, 2 border crossings, and one unforgettable story about a brick fight. The next morning, it was time to set out and explore El Salvador's surf coast. El Salvador is experiencing a real tourism boom at the moment, and that's the result of sweeping government changes that have taken place in recent years. I'll be talking more about that later in this vlog, but one of the centerpieces of that strategy has been the promotion and development of this region as one of the premier surf destinations of Central America. I started the day with breakfast, pupusas. These are El Salvador's national dish, although they're also popular in neighboring Honduras. A pupusa is essentially a thick corn tortilla stuffed with fillings such as cheese, beans, meat, or vegetables, and then grilled until golden. They might not be the most photogenic food in the world, but they are absolutely delicious and make for a perfect breakfast, lunch, or dinner. After that, I took a local bus, I think it only cost $1 or $2, to the regional center of La Libertad, which was where I wired some more money to myself on Western Union. I was still relying on this method to get cash to myself after the debit card issues that I had experienced in Ecuador. From there, I made my way back along the coast towards Playa El Tunco, the most famous beach on El Salvador's surf coast. One thing to mention is that these beaches aren't exactly what a lot of people are imagining when we talk about the Central American coastline. You're not coming here for powdery white sand or turquoise water. The beaches along this stretch of the coastline are dark sand volcanic beaches, rugged and dramatic rather than postcard perfect. What draws most people here are the waves, and the waves are exceptional. I've tried surfing before, I wasn't particularly good at it, and I can't say it ever became a passion of mine, so rather than joining the surfers, I was happy to stay on dry land and watch the professionals do what they do best. I grabbed a cold drink at one of the beachfront bars and settled in for the afternoon. It was low season because of the rains, and a tropical storm system further north was making the swells rougher than usual. As a result, the town felt pleasantly quiet. Most of the bars and cafes only had a handful of customers, which made it a great place to sit back, relax, and watch the surfers carving their way across the gnarly waves. That evening I headed back to the hostel, called it a night, and then the next morning I was headed further west to Playa El Zonte. Playa El Zonte is probably the most visitor-friendly beach on this part of the coast, although it's still very much a surf town first and foremost. Like the other beaches here, it has dark volcanic sand and powerful waves, but it also has a laid-back atmosphere that makes it easy to spend an entire day doing very little. I found a spot on the sand, ordered a cold drink, and then spent the rest of the day adjusting to a slower pace of life. One thing that caught my eye in Playa El Zonte was Bitcoin Beach House. That's of note because in 2021, El Salvador was the first country in the world to make a cryptocurrency legal tender. As such, you can find cafes, hotels, and shops where you can pay using Bitcoin just by tapping your phone. Furthermore, El Salvador doesn't use its own currency anymore. Instead, it uses the US dollar alongside Bitcoin. Another thing that struck me about El Salvador is just how green the country is. This place is absolutely verdant. Everywhere I went, there were rolling green hills, lush vegetation, and palm trees. It felt tropical in an almost exaggerated sort of way. I also noticed that El Salvador was probably the most outwardly religious place that I had seen in Latin America. That's not to say that other countries weren't religious, because many of them were, but here it felt especially visible in everyday life. Walking through towns in the evening, you would hear singing coming from churches, see families dressed for religious services, and encounter communities that seemed much more socially conservative and traditional than elsewhere on my journey. That evening back at the hammock plantation, I encountered another traveler who unfortunately had to cut his journey short due to a serious health problem. Unfortunately, he was dealing with the situation by sinking in a drunken oblivion, and that made it pretty uncomfortable to be around for not just myself, but a whole bunch of other travelers there. Fortunately, we were both checking out the next morning. The next morning, I walked down to the corner of the main road and waited for a bus to take me onwards to the capital, San Salvador. Like many buses throughout Central America, it was an old American school bus that had been given a second life, hauling passengers around the country. The journey to the capital took about an hour and a half, winding through green countryside before eventually arriving in the nation's largest city, where I checked into the lovely Hostel Cumbres de Volcán Flor Blanca. While the surf coast is really at the center of the tourist boom in El Salvador, it's San Salvador that is really the showpiece of this transformation. For decades, El Salvador was plagued by gang violence and general insecurity. Today, however, much of that has changed. The government in El Salvador has pursued an aggressive crackdown on violent crime, and the country is now one of the safest places to visit in Central America. When I'm traveling, I try not to be that person who just inserts themselves into conversations about local politics and suddenly claims to be an expert about them. But one thing I can say is that what I kept hearing from Salvadorians while I was there was that although the crackdown on violent crime was ruthless, most of them that I heard from seemed to be grateful for the fact that they were able to go down to the local supermarket without fear of being murdered anymore. Of course, that might only be part of the story, and there are questions about the methods that were used to achieve the current state of security that El Salvador finds itself in. And it's also fair to say that maybe if someone disagreed with those policies, they mightn't have been too vocal about it. What I can say is that as a visitor, San Salvador felt remarkably clean, orderly, and safe. The historic center itself isn't especially spectacular, perhaps a little like San Jose in Costa Rica or Managua in Nicaragua, but the newer parts of the city are genuinely impressive. Looking out across the central plaza is a striking modern library, which sits opposite the city's cathedral and serves as a symbol of the capital's renewal. And towering above it all is the San Salvador volcano, which dominates the skyline and serves as a constant reminder that in Central America, nature is never far away. Of all the capitals that I've visited in Central America, I can honestly say that San Salvador was probably one of the most pleasant. While I was there, I also picked up a piece of dulce de pan, which is a local sweetbread, and used it to celebrate the Salvadorian edition of my 40th birthday. As I sat there in the city center, a local family struck up a conversation with me and seemed quite amused by the fact that I was there celebrating my birthday with a giant slice of sweetbread by myself. The portion was enormous, so I was more than happy to share the rest of it with them. Also, do any of you guys out there get random cravings for chocolate thick shakes? I certainly do, and one of those cravings hit that night while I was in San Salvador, so I searched around for a local gem, but unfortunately ended up at Burger King. Not proud of it, but it hit the spot. If you can relate to that level of dedication, please consider giving this video a like, subscribe to my channel, and share it on your social media. And if you're really enjoying the journey, then please tell your family and friends about my YouTube channel. It really helps me build my audience and builds a bit of a community around what I'm doing here. Before I left San Salvador, I also picked up a small charm for my charm bracelet. This time it was a small wooden surfboard. The next morning, I walked the short distance through some strange urban rainforest to one of San Salvador's many bus stations, and then boarded one of the old American school buses towards my next destination, San Salvador, a major transport hub in western El Salvador. These buses are wonderfully retro. They're noisy, rattly, and certainly not luxurious, but they get the job done. We bounced our way through the Salvadorian countryside before arriving in San Salvador, where I changed onto an even older bus for the final leg of my journey to Wahua, in the heart of El Salvador's highlands and the famous Ruta de las Flores. As its name suggests, the Ruta de las Flores, or the Route of the Flowers, is famous for its colourful blooms and picturesque mountain towns. The best time to visit there is between November and February, when the flowers are at their peak. I was there out of season, but as you'll see, it was still pretty special. When I arrived in Wahua, I checked into the lovely Que Ondas hostel, perched on a hillside overlooking the town. The property felt more like a tropical garden than a hostel, with lush vegetation, colourful flowers, and views out across the surrounding mountains. That evening I wandered down to the town centre, where a local festival was underway. Food stalls lined the streets, music filled the air, and the whole town seemed to be out enjoying the evening. The next morning it was time to set out and explore the Ruta de las Flores. Even before leaving the hostel, the day had already begun, surrounded by tropical plants, orchids, lilies, moss-covered walls, and every shade of green imaginable. It was beautiful. I headed into town for breakfast, which was pupusas and a strong local coffee. El Salvador produces some of the world's best coffee, and this region is particularly known for growing some of the best beans in the country. After breakfast, I rented a motorbike and set off along the Ruta de las Flores. This is one of those places that feels like it was designed to be explored on two wheels. The road winds through rolling hills, coffee plantations, forests, and small mountain towns. Throughout the day, I rode almost to Sonsonate in one direction, and then nearly all the way to Ahuachapan in the other, stopping wherever something interesting caught my eye. My favorite stop was Concepcion de Ataco, a charming colonial town known for its colorful murals, cobbled streets, and cozy cafes. The ride itself was just as rewarding as the towns. Along the way, I passed flowering trees, climbing vines, hibiscus bushes, coffee farms, roadside fruit stalls, and sweeping views across the mountains. I stopped at Laguna Verde for a while before continuing on through the countryside. The beauty of Ruta de las Flores isn't one particular attraction, it's the journey itself. Riding through the mountains, pulling over whenever something catches your eye, and discovering small towns and local businesses that you would never have found otherwise. By evening, I made my way back to Wahua, just in time to watch the sun setting over the surrounding hills. I didn't spend long in El Salvador. There are plenty of other things to see in El Salvador, including the Santa Ana volcano, which is visible from the Ruta de las Flores. However, at this point, I had already been volcano surfing, and I had seen volcanoes in other parts of Latin America, so I decided that it was time to keep moving. The next morning, it was onwards to my next destination, and to find out where that is, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe, and tune in again next time on Latin America Diaries.